Hey, welcome back to the City Rev Life podcast. My name is Robey. This is Rebekah, and we are in a series called Healthy Conflict in Marriage. And we're actually kicking off a new part to this series with this episode. And what we're going to be talking about today is specifically communication, the anatomy of communication. A lot of times there are things that cause conflict, but if the communication itself is causing more conflict, that's not helping at all. So we're going to be talking about some practical things to keep in mind when it comes to conflict. And really this applies to anything, but especially in marriage. And so maybe you're watching this and you are married, been married for many, many years. I think this will be very relatable and hopefully helpful. Maybe you're wanting to get married, or you're engaged, or you're dating someone. All of these things, whatever those stages of life that you may find yourself in, we hope and pray that this is helpful for you. But before we jump into the topic at hand, let's just do a little bit of a review. We've been talking about specifically kind of the premise of the series is that conflict does not always mean that something has gone wrong. There is going to be conflict in marriage. That's actually part of the iron sharpening iron. But we're really trying to use the scripture plus science and research, neuroscience, to help us think through how to do this conflict in a way that actually helps us grow in our marriage. So Rebekah, maybe walk us through a little bit, especially from the neuroscience perspective of some of the ground that we've covered so far.
Right. So we've been looking at conflict from a neuroscience perspective. Specifically, the two parts of the brain that we've been discussing is the frontal lobe, which is responsible for all that good reasoning skills, that good judgment, which is where we want to stay in our brains when we're in conflict, because it helps us stay grounded, being able to ebb and flow with the stress sometimes of conflict. And then we've also talked about the other part of our brain, the amygdala, or the stress center, which is really only responsible for three behaviors. It's only responsible for fight, flight, or freeze. And so we've been talking about how to stay in that frontal lobe part of our brain during conflict, or if our stress center gets triggered, how to kind of carry ourselves back to that frontal lobe, kind of creating a neurological pathway, laying those bricks so that you can get yourself back to that frontal lobe for good conflict resolution.
You know, it's funny because when I'm thinking and I'm in conflict and I'm frustrated with someone, I'm not thinking like about, I need a new neurological pathway right now. But it's when you think about it, that's exactly what you feel like when that explains what's happening and what you feel when all of a sudden you're at work, or maybe it's at home, or it's with a family member, and you just feel your blood pressure rising. Right. You feel your heartbeat going faster. You're feeling angry. And we all know that whatever happens next is not going to be as productive if we could stay calm, be clear thinking. And that's really the difference we're talking about, right?
Absolutely. It's exactly right. And you're using those cues as a reminder to show you, I need to get myself back to that good place of reasoning. So, and what's awesome too is, and we've been looking about how this also applies from a biblical standpoint. You know, we've been journeying through Proverbs, and research continues to confirm what has been in scripture and be able to show us how we can navigate through stress and conflict in our marriage by applying these biblical principles. And research continues to confirm that over time. Yeah,
absolutely. And that is always wonderful to see, but shouldn't be a surprise. I mean, we know that God has all the truth that we need that is contained in Scripture. And so we go to Scripture, and we love science because science is discovering God's creation. And so we are never surprised that those two are not going to be at odds. And so anyway, let's jump into Proverbs. And again, the topic at hand, we're talking about the anatomy of the communication itself. And I want to take a look at Proverbs chapter 15, just verse 13. It's a simple verse, and I think I've seen this like on, coasters of Christian art and stuff like that. But there's a real depth to this verse. Yes. It says, "A glad heart makes a cheerful face, but by sorrow of heart the spirit is crushed." A glad heart makes a cheerful face is the main idea here in this verse I want to take a look at. And what you see in this little hint, this quick little proverb, is something that seems simple. If you feel this joy in your heart, if there's a cheerfulness in your heart, your face is going to express it. And that seems simple, but that is actually speaking to a profound concept of nonverbal communication. And when we communicate, God has wired us that what is coming out of our hearts is going to be communicated through all types of things. It's through not just the words that we say. And so we want to take that seriously, that He's made us to do that. And so walk us through that, Rebekah, just a little bit of what does the research say just about communication, nonverbals, the importance of that?
Yeah. So it's so important that our nonverbals line up with our verbal communication, because when there's a conflict between the two, research shows that the nonverbal communication is going to trump the verbal communication. So 93% of all communication is nonverbal. So that's a huge thing to understand and digest, because when we are communicating, a lot of our nonverbal communication is what's being heard or seen and interpreted.
It's hard to even believe that sometimes, that 93% is not the actual content. It's not the words that we chose. It's the whole presentation.
Yeah, and we'll tease that out in a minute. But to kind of dissect that for even further, specifically 55% of that nonverbal communication is going to be your body language. So things like your posture, your facial expressions, your eye contact, your hand gestures. A lot of that is going to communicate something, whether you realize it or not. The other 38% is your tone. And again, that's something that's hard to kind of measure, but we all know what it feels like when someone's tone moves from easy to maybe critical or judgmental. We all kind of have some experiences either on the receiving end or on the giving end where that tone has really played a role in our communication. So that leaves us at last 7% is your content. So taking inventory of all of that is an important role it plays in effectively having conflict resolution.
Yeah, it's like that is such a common part of our lives, is just communicating with people. And I think a classic example that probably everyone has experienced is, you come home from work, or you arrive at the office, or you have a meeting, and it could be any setting, and someone's like, "Oh, how did it go? How'd your day go? How'd the meeting go?" And the person says, "Fine." Or a teenager, how was your day at school? Fine. It's like their word is saying that it was fine. Fine is a positive word. Fine means that things went well, or at least decent. But everything else, like their head is hung down and their shoulders are slumped, their tone is angry and mad. Their
eye roll, maybe
an eye roll, or maybe they're crossing their arms, or whatever it may be. Maybe they slam the door behind them, or whatever it may be. You can say fine, but everything else about you is saying it was anything but fine. I think we've all had that experience before, and it's a reminder that what this proverb is saying is that out of our heart, God has wired that our hearts, what's in our heart is communicated with our whole bodies, our face, our tone, our gestures, our eye contact or eye rolling or whatever it may be. All of that is communicating what is out of our heart. And I think probably what's happening is, without even realizing it, we're taking inventory of each other's nonverbal communication all the time, because we intuitively, instinctually know this, and we're trying to say, we're looking at the nonverbals and trying to discern, is that content really true of what's in their heart? Right. And we're, if their content lines up, their tone lines up, their nonverbals line up, then that feels authentic, because we might be able to coach our words to say one thing, but it's hard to get all of our communication authentically communicating what's in our heart. And that's a good thing. That helps us. If we can understand those nonverbals, then it can really, really help us in how we're communicating. And so maybe just walk us through this a little bit more, about just specifically men and women handle nonverbals a little bit differently.
Sure. Yeah. I was reading in a book by an author, Katie Cole, who does a lot of research in this area. And she kind of dissected one specific dynamic, but between men and women specifically, and how this plays out. So women's nonverbal listening cues look very different than men's listening cues nonverbally. So a woman will tend to nod or smile or give that minimal encouragement like, as a way of tracking with the speaker. And so, what she's trying to communicate in that moment is, yes, I'm tracking with you. What you're saying, what you are saying is important to me. I value that. But what research is showing is that men interpret those nonverbal cues as she agrees with me. So you can see that dynamic of what she's meaning to communicate by those nonverbal cues and how it's being received most often by a man. With men, their nonverbal cues are going to be a little bit different. They're going to look like maybe avoiding eye contact, not for the sake of being disrespectful or rude, but just as a way of concentrating. They might look off into the corner of the room just to kind of get some blank space to be able to process what's being said. They may rarely nod or rarely give that minimal encouragement, like, yeah. And it's, again, not as a sign of it's not important to me, but just that's their way of receiving information and truly digesting it. So what a man is meaning by that typically is I'm processing. What a woman tends to interpret those nonverbal cues as is he's not listening to me, or I'm not getting his attention, or he's not even paying attention to what I'm saying. So a lot of times those misfires can happen simply by just misinterpreting those nonverbal cues through our own lenses.
Yeah, I was thinking about, like, imagine two couples go to like a football game and they're hanging out, and the ladies sit together and the guys sit together. The ladies will probably turn with the field here and talk like this. Guys will never even look away from the field and will have the whole conversation like this. Like, I think if I'm thinking back to some of, like, even the meetings I have with other guys in my office or in their office, like, it's probably bizarre. Like, we're probably not even ever, like, looking at each other the entire time. We might be sitting across the table from each other, but, like, kind of looking around. And we have very, very different nonverbals. And so I'm imagining then there's also some research on how this then creates misfires within, like, a marriage context, or just between men and women in general.
Right. So when that cue gets misinterpreted for a woman, what research shows she can tend to do is either over-argue her point with more examples, more data, more information, or even sometimes more emotion. And that can muddy the waters. That now we've introduced a new conflict to the original conflict at hand that we're trying to communicate. Now we're trying to overemphasize our point, and it's coming across a lot stronger maybe than what was intended. So that's a cue for a listener when a woman is maybe feeling or fielding those cues and misinterpreting them. For a male, one of the common ways that he can misfire when that dynamic is at hand is he can tend to assume the other party is affirming or agreeing with him, so he continues to keep going and keeps arguing his point or
goes to the next point.
Goes to the next point, right. Creating that more colorful picture because he assumes, oh, the listener's tracking with me, and she agrees. In actuality, she's just affirming that she's tracking, but then she never really feels like she had space to speak into it, give her opinion, or maybe her opinion doesn't feel valued. And so then those misfires can tend to happen back and forth, and it's no longer a conversation about the content at hand. Now there's this nonverbal argument almost happening, trying to feel heard, validated, and valued.
Yeah. So again, just where we started was there's enough conflict in general, enough things to work through within the context of any relationship, but also in marriage. It's an iron sharpening iron situation. God has put a married couple together to be used by God to be bringing something beautiful about in each other. And so there's going to be content that needs to be worked through and processed through, and it can be wonderful and healing. Yeah. So if we can clean up the communication part of that, we're not adding another dimension. I think that's such a good point about how so often with a man maybe not giving the nonverbals that a woman is expecting can feel like disrespectful or not, or not taking seriously what's being said, not prioritizing the conversation. And then a woman maybe then is over arguing, then the point keeps going because she doesn't know that she's being heard. Right. Where on the other side, a woman is giving very active nonverbals, and then a man is assuming she agrees when she doesn't, so keeps going and hasn't given a space for her to share. And I think that's great. And so as we're thinking through those, we're going to be hitting some of what are practical ways to then disrupt this cycle so that these communication through this series, we're going to be hitting practical ways to disrupt that cycle. Yep. And so that we can have more healthy, clean conversation. Maybe kind of talk through, Rebekah, what are some of the practical things through the next several episodes that we're going to hit in this series?
Right. So what you just described, those misfires, is basically when both stress centers have been triggered. So one or both are now communicating and firing as opposed to that good frontal lobe that we're wanting. So we're going to talk through over the next several episodes ways to get ourselves back into that frontal lobe, or do that for each other, safeguard that for each other when we see those cues like, I see that we're going down that path where we're going to be talking stress center to stress center, and that's not what we want. So looking today at what are those nonverbal communication skills or cues that we're giving each other, taking inventory for ourselves, is part of the groundwork that we can lay when we lay those neurological bricks that we've talked about, giving attention to those nonverbals outside as well as in the conflict. Secondly, we're going to talk about a skill called paraphrasing. We've mentioned it before, especially on other podcasts, but it's a really effective communication tool when trying to discern how to get yourself back to that level playing field and working together and co-laboring in the midst of conflict. We're also going to do the ability to just stay curious and to stay exploratory, which again is another function of the frontal lobe, how to stay there and get there to continue the conversation, make space for that input for each other. And then just also argue how and why we need these skills and when to use them and when to get help. Yeah,
I think that's great. Looking forward to walking through those together through this series. But let's just take one practical thing away from this episode today. Maybe you've heard this idea before. Maybe it's not new to you that nonverbals are a majority of what's getting transmitted. And maybe you say, yeah, I think I've heard that before. Maybe it was at like a training at work, on customer service, or it was a training for how to work with other employees or whatever. And that's great. A lot of times the information like that, we are more active in using in a work context than we are in a marriage context. And I would say if marriage is our most important relationship outside of a relationship with God, then we would want to give our best in our communication in our marriage. And so let's take inventory coming out of this episode. Let's take inventory of our nonverbals. Let's take what we know about nonverbals and then tendencies within men and women. Obviously, there's differences with individual cases, but tendencies within men and women. And let's employ that within our marriage. And so maybe one practical thing would be starting with men, maybe being more active in the nonverbals and knowing that will communicate a lot to your spouse, to your wife. And thinking especially about eye contact. We may not mean anything by it to be like listening and looking off, but we may be inadvertently communicating something by not having eye contact. Ladies, what I would say is this gives great information as far as what you should expect from the man in your life, and maybe understanding that what it's like seems like the nonverbals are communicating is not necessarily what he means to communicate, but it also may be a cue that there are some settings that you can put a guy in that's going to make him maybe feel more comfortable. I think sometimes us as guys, the eye contact feels intense, unnecessarily intense to have this eye contact. It's like a high noon showdown in an old Western. It's like it feels overly intense. A lot of times guys we can open up more when we're shoulder to shoulder with someone rather than eyeball to eyeball. Sometimes going on a walk or a drive or talking during an activity. Sometimes that's the place where a man or husband might feel the most comfortable opening up. And so maybe that is a context that you can use within your marriage. And so let's take inventory of our nonverbals thinking through this session. We got plenty more to go in this upcoming series, so we hope you join us. And hey, thanks for joining us today on the City Rev Life podcast, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you for joining us on City Rev Life. You can subscribe to this podcast, rate and review wherever you're listening to this. And we love it when you share it with your friends on social media. For more videos and content, go ahead and check us out at cityrev.org/podcast or download our City Rev Church app. Have a great day.